Good morning, everyone. Aloha kako and talofa lava. Ladies and gentlemen, I am humbled and honored to welcome our next speaker, who is an inspiration to many, especially to women across the Pacific and the world, whose authority on climate change and resiliency is unmatched and incredibly moving. Senator Hilda Heine served as the 8th President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands from 2016 to January 2020. She is the first woman to serve as the President of the country and the first woman to serve as head of state in any of the 5 Micronesian countries of the North Pacific. Prior to becoming president, Dr. Heine was the nation's Minister of Education. She is currently a senator representing Auru Atoll. Dr. Heine was the first person in the Marshall Islands to earn a doctorate degree. In 1987, she co-founded the women's rights group Women United Together Marshall Islands. She attended university in the United States, where she earned an undergraduate at the University of Oregon. She earned her master's degree at the University of Hawaiʻi and an educational doctorate at the University of Southern California. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Senator and former President of the Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine.
Thank you, Tolua, for that introduction. Can you see me? I was going to say that when I was president of the Marshall Islands, I had a staff following me around with a step up so that I can be seen behind the podium. Actually, I'm kidding. But it would be nice to have expandable podium so that short people can be seen properly when they're giving remarks like this. Thank you. Thank you. Aloha, everyone. Aloha. All right. President Suzanne Paris-Lum, members of the East-West Center Board of Governors, distinguished journalists, panelists, and guests, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I offer a special tribute to the people of this land. I bring greetings from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, or as we say in our islands, Yahweh. Yahweh kumaolep, kumol, kamolol, iroj, kanrainin miyenin. Convening impactful dialogues is one of the strategic priorities of the East-West Center, and this annual international media conference is a East-West branded conference focusing on an area of governance that speaks to openness and transparency. Thank you, Komol Tada, for the invitation to speak on connecting on climate in the Pacific Islands. As a Pacific Islander who lives in the front lines of the climate change crisis, I can assure you that the core message remains the same. Climate change is an existential threat to every nation in Oceania. Among other threats, climate change is the primary security threat we face in the Pacific Islands. The Boyd Declaration on Regional Security issued by the Pacific Islands Forum leaders in 2018 reaffirmed that, and I quote, climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, unquote. Recent events taking place in the Pacific region have heightened and brought together leaders firmly behind this declaration, further making it clear, or crystal clear, that climate change is the greatest security threat facing the countries of the Pacific Islands and their communities. Without urgent global action to cut emissions, low-lying atoll states like mine face the prospect of annihilation due to rising seas. When the highest natural land formation in your country is 2 meters above sea level, even incremental rises in that level signal a disaster. This annual International Media Conference is an opportunity to reinforce the message about the role the media play in the fight against climate change. That the media is influential and can shape public opinion on climate change and environmental protections is not lost to all of us gathered here today, including those listening from afar. The media is a wide-ranging or reaching force that can communicate what is happening in the world to everyday people. Undoubtedly, the media has sharpened our understanding of climate change, but if I may suggest, it can improve coverage by dedicating more time to talking about relevant and up-to-date information about climate change and by providing consistent and in-depth coverage. By making the science behind climate change understandable to everyday people, and especially to the disability community. By making the science by spending more time discussing solutions and not overwhelming readers with the problems. Repeated focus on the impacts of climate change can leave the public with an overall sense of powerlessness. Or by centering human rights in the coverage of the climate crisis. By highlighting sustainable indigenous practices. For example, in the dry and frequently drought-ridden Northern Marshall Islands, families there place high value on sun-dried food processes or food preservation processes for seafood, as well as for seasonal local food plants, including pulp from the pandanus fruit, we call it megon. Some varieties of the pandanus tree produce nutrition-rich megon, which when sun-dried over several days, turns into healthy, sweet dried snack known as jagaga. Jagaga can be eaten by itself, soaked in water to make nutritious drink, or eaten with coconut meat for a full meal. These can last for months without refrigeration, fit for long voyage or ocean voyages across the Marshall Islands. Sustainable practices are living examples of positive human interactions with the planet. They tell us it is possible to not exploit labor and land. There are numerous other practices, and it takes the media to scale up such practices by widely disseminating the knowledge to others. It is possible for us to change the world. Individual actions make a difference. Combined, they can lead to critical systemic change. The media has a lot of control over how we think of problems in general. If people walk away without adequate and nuanced climate coverage, not understanding the science, failing to see how it impacts their local communities, and thinking climate change is beyond repairable, we will all be paralyzed beyond inaction. The media has already advanced us so far, but we cannot make the final steps toward a real, sustainable, and humane world if the media does not continue to step up in these ways. There is a need for more training of our journalists to be able to analyze and carry well-informed pieces on climate change issues. And newspapers and radio, TV, and other publishers should provide space for journalists to discuss, dissect, and explore in an authoritative way about findings of important reports, for example, IPCC reports. Climate change is a critical issue, of course, but we must also acknowledge that this life or death challenge is taking place as the Pacific region is again the site of big power showdowns and the worrisome flexing of economic, diplomatic, and military muscle by China and the West. Professor Stephen Ratuva, the director of the Macmillan Brown Center for Pacific Studies at Canterbury University, recently wrote in the Itangata blog about this, and I quote, "In the battle for geopolitical influence and supremacy in the Pacific, the two most visible antagonists, the Anglo-West and China, are often the only two sides which matter to the mainstream media and political discourse. The third side, the Pacific big ocean states or BOS, are often forgotten or relegated to the margin. In a subconscious way, this hierarchy of significance has roots in the colonial discourse, which continue to undermine Pacific agency in various ways to this day," unquote. We in the Pacific region have witnessed the media focus on the China and US power struggle for our region. And it is very much in line with the sort of thinking that has focused foreign policy on the Pacific Rim and places value on the surrounding countries rather than the people occupying the islands and ocean in between. It is exactly the type of attitude that journalists and media personnel imply when they tell us that, and I quote, "If climate change is such a problem, why don't you relocate or migrate to other places? It is so much easier," unquote. This and other like comment presume that the Pacific Islanders, as Pacific Islanders, we don't know what we want and what is important to us. Such commentaries would not know the importance or the important connections we have to our lands, for example. That to leave our land for safety elsewhere means a critical connection to our culture is severed. That we primarily rely on outsiders to tell our story of the climate crisis is one of our challenges. Now, this is in criticism of outsiders who have given generously of their time and resources to help the region. Not at all. But the hard truth is that the Pacific Islands also need to tell their own story in their own words. The saying, "Nothing about us without us," reflects this sentiment. That's what comes to mind when I think of a new climate change message in the Pacific. But we in this room know that. What you may not know is that in my country, at least, we are on our own initiative taking steps to respond vigorously and creatively to the threat at our doorstep. In fact, I'd like to use my brief remarks to share with you some good news on the climate change front. Earlier this year, local media executives from the Marshall Islands Journal, 692 Productions, and Power 103.9, and other media enthusiasts organized and registered a nonprofit corporation, the Pacific Media Institute. The Institute has several goals, but the most important in my estimation is training Marshallese to be effective communicators, whether the distribution medium is print, broadcast, podcast, or social media. The Pacific Media Institute just held its first training program, the theme of which was telling Pacific stories. It's an auspicious start for this important organization. In addition to these efforts, the local youth environmentalist nonprofit, George Jigum, has hosted a climate and health arts summer camp for high school students for the past 3 years, which teaches youth the latest information and science on climate change that intersects with health and gives them training in painting, poetry, weaving, and songwriting so that they can create new pieces on what they've learned. It transforms our youth from passive victims of climate change to artists creating new work that speaks out and speaks back to the climate crisis. My daughter reminds me often that art is just as much an important part of media and storytelling, especially in the climate crisis. It's one thing to write about rising sea levels, but quite something else when you're standing in a garden gone fallow because rising sea levels have fouled the atoll's freshwater lanes, or to travel to islets that scientists predict will be the first to be inundated by rising tides. The battle of climate change will continue, and the road ahead will test our resolve. But I'm heartened that the independent news media in the Republic of the Marshall Islands is joining the fight, as well as the next generation of youth climate activists. And for that, I'm very grateful. That isn't the only positive development on the media front in the Marshall Islands. I am pleased to announce that I am part of a photographic initiative to preserve through still images and video all 33 of the atolls and islands in the Marshall Islands. I'm working with Hawaii-based photographer Floyd Takuji, an American who is born and raised on Majuro. We call our project a dream of atolls. Our goal is to ensure that there is a collective memory of every atoll and island in the Marshall Islands, no matter what the rising tides do to our country. The Pacific Media Institute, Joe Jigum, and our atoll documentation project are important because they're about Marshallese telling their own stories and finding unique and creative ways to do so. We no longer have to rely entirely on the good graces of others to tell our own stories about climate change and a host of other issues. These aren't solutions to climate change, but these initiatives begin to change the calculus of how we respond to threats to our existence. There is no victim mentality in my world. And with that, I look forward to a lively discussion today. Thank you, Komoltada.
Hello. Thank you so much, Senator Heine, for such a beautiful speech. Very moving, and I think a lot of our audience agree with so much of your points as far as how media can actually get in further with the fight against climate change. I just want to open up the floor to anyone who may have any questions for Senator Heine. We do have a few minutes here. Go ahead, sir. Thank you.
Retired journalist from New York, and thank you for your speech, Senator. I wanted to ask you, of the 33 atolls in the Marshall Islands, are all of them inhabited? Also, how many of them do scientists expect will disappear within, say, the next 25 or 50 years?
Thank you for that question. Of the 33 islands, 24 of them are inhabited. As for the numbers that will be inundated in 2050s, 2060s, I don't have the numbers, but all of the islands are low islands, so we expect that at least 6 have been predicted that will go under. There might be more. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Again, if you have any other questions, we have some time here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Heine. I just have a brief question linking it to our local context here in Hawaii, as most recently we've had reporting and many testimonies of specifically children who have been subjected to fuel in the freshwater drinking source for this island, as our main aquifer is being poisoned actively by the US military. So as reporters are following this story in coalition with local organizations, how would you suggest reporting on specifically like photographs of children having chemical burns and very sensitive, painful experiences that the local residents are feeling as they do not consent to this occupation of the land and destruction of the environment? Thank you.
Can you repeat that question again? I didn't really understand what you're asking me to comment on.
As reporters and various other organizations cover particularly sensitive and traumatizing, painful testimonies, how would you suggest approaching, for outsiders to communities, approaching those kinds of stories, particularly when there's an active agent in the land involved?
I haven't followed that story, but I think it's important to be sensitive to the issue and also to inform. So the important thing here is if it's dangerous to people, I think we need to know. And the more information that is shared, the better. I think, although it might be sensitive, if it's harming people, especially children, I think it's important to communicate that clearly. I don't know if I answered your question.
Sorry, go ahead, ma'am.
I believe there's an online question, so I was waiting for that.
Oh,
No, there are no questions from the online audience at this time.
okay.
All right. I'm Disha Shetty. I'm a climate journalist from India. International climate conferences tend to have predominantly journalists from developed countries. And of course, the coverage is very skewed in favor of the West. In what ways can journalists, both developed and from developing countries, help small island nations when we cover these conferences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was also thinking about the same thing in this conference. I wasn't seeing too many Pacific Island journalists, and I'm not sure why they're not here, or maybe they're here, I just don't know. But I haven't seen the ones that I know. I think it's important to help sponsor reporters from the region, especially, so that they can come to these conferences and be able to communicate the issues. But at the same time, the reporters that are there should talk to the Pacific Island representatives that are in these conferences and get as much information from them about their issues before they make the reports and they write their articles. As I mentioned in my statement, if it's not with us, then it's not about us. So they need to talk to Pacific representatives that are there. There are plenty of them. And to ensure that the coverage is accurate and on point. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. Our next question.
Aloha, Iokwe. My name is John Letman. I'm coming from Kauai. Thank you, Senator Heine. I'd had a question for you. The Marshall Islands has a well-known legacy of displacement from the nuclear testing era by the United States, the 67 test. I want to know, do you see any connection with the potential for possible displacement in the future based on climate change, and what kind of lessons can be taken from the nuclear displacement? Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's a very good question, and one that I didn't address in my remarks. I think the nuclear issue is one that needs a whole hour to discuss and cover. So it's very important. And yes, the nuclear legacy has displaced many Marshallese. They're still being displaced to this day. And that is one of the challenge that we face. We've learned about displacement from the nuclear legacy. And so we're very much aware that with this climate crisis, that is going to add to the number of Marshallese that will be displaced. That's why we're out there talking about climate change and trying to do our best. We're trying to lead from the front because we believe that if we don't get out there and try to find solution for this problem, we will be the one that will be most affected. So yes, I think the displacement will happen, and we're working with the US and other multilateral partners to see what we can do in terms of adapting our islands so that we can cope with the climate crisis. The current compact negotiations with the United States include a discussion on the climate crisis because we realize that we cannot do it on our own. We need assistance from our donor partners, especially US, at this, if we're going to save our country. Thank you.
Senator, my name is Nirmal Ghosh with the Straits Times of Singapore. You mentioned how the media covers great power rivalry as if some nations don't really matter or have any agency. I think you had a very good quote you cited on that the Pacific Island nations, have agency. I'm curious as to your view of the recent controversy over China's agreement with the Solomon Islands and the reaction to it in the US, in Australia, and so forth. Would that be an example of what you are trying to say? What is your view on that? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Exactly, I think that's one of the, this very same issue came up when China was trying to sign an agreement with Solomon Islands. And there was not enough coverage of what happened in the Solomon Islands. Why did Solomon Islands went to China in the first place? After so many years of being a friend with the United States and Australia, what happened? I think those are the questions that journalists need to find out, because things don't just happen overnight and for no reason. I think the president of Solomon Islands was looking to secure his country and his people. And it may not be right in our estimation, because we're from the West and we think that we should always stay with the West. But he had a responsibility for his, to his people. And if the offer there was, was good for his people, I don't blame him for taking it. So I think we need to examine the relationships we have with the Pacific Island countries. And as I said before, sometimes we ignore these countries because they're small, the populations are small, land masses are small, and we don't really spend time investing in their welfare until it's too late. So I hope that this was a lesson learned, and that from here on there would be more consultation with Pacific Island countries. Thank you.
Hi, President Susie.
Aloha, thank you so much, Senator, and thank you for your leadership as a first female president in the Marshall Islands, and also your leadership on the Board of Governors for the East-West Center, and your service and example. I do have a couple questions. You brought up wonderful points about the uniqueness of the Marshall Islands and the Pacific. I wondered if you could comment a little more on, I just came from the Congressional Roundtable on the Pacific in Washington, D.C., and someone made a point about the uniqueness of climate change's impact to the Pacific as opposed to the Caribbean because of location and distance. That's one question. Sorry, I have a two-part. I wondered if you mentioned a little bit about the diaspora. And, here in Hawaii and California and other parts of the United States, I wondered if you could comment a little bit about the diaspora and how the climate might impact future growth of that diaspora as a result of the future predictions on rising sea levels.
Thank you. That's a very good question, President Susie. Yes, the diaspora issue is a challenge for the Marshall Islands. We're losing talents as people move from the country, but people are moving constantly, and the numbers are increasing by the days and months. And so people are seeking security. That's why we're talking about climate crisis as a security issue. People know that if their islands are not going to be there, they need to secure their families. And so as this is happening, people are migrating to the US. I believe the Marshall Islands has now close to 30,000 people in the US in different parts of the country. We are a country of 60,000 people, so we'll probably have half of them are outside already. And we don't know what's going to happen in the coming years. But this is an issue that is facing us, and what is happening is also affecting the receiving states and territories that are welcoming these people from not just the Marshall Islands, but also from the Federated States of Micronesia. And so I think it's a common issue that we need to discuss and resolve together. And I think that's also one of the reasons we're putting the climate crisis in the discussion with the US, because either way they're going to have to deal with this issue. And it's better that it's part of the discussion with the governments as they're going forward. Thank you.
I think we're just out of time. I do want to thank everyone for their questions. Oh, we can take one more question, sir. Apologies on that. Thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I'm Glenn from Van Media Group in Singapore. Thank you, Senator, for your comments. There are two schools of thought about climate change. I'm not an expert from what I understand, though. On one side, people are still trying to fight it and get people to sign on to global agreements to reduce carbon and that. And the other side says it's frankly too late. We can still try to reduce carbon, but the sea levels are going to rise. They're already rising. And there needs to be a plan for resilience and looking forward and how to deal with the inevitability of sea change levels. While we don't want to give up hope that we can sort of stem the climate crisis, the reality is that probably many of these islands will be impacted even more than they currently are by storms, by rising sea levels. What is your view on that, and what resilience needs to happen among the islands of the Pacific, looking forward?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that question. I think maybe my daughter would have been the better person to answer that question. She's working, part of a team that's working on the Marshall Islands adaptation plan, national adaptation plan, which we call a survival plan. But part of it is looking not only at adaptation, but also resilience, making sure that people are able to take care of themselves as conditions are getting worsened. And so I think it's important that we do both resilience and adaptation. And Marshall Islands is realizing that we cannot just sit and focus our efforts on resilience. We also have to do adaptation, and we've explored possibilities of raising islands as an effort to make sure that we don't lose our country to sea level rise. So we're doing both fronts because we have to be realistic. And I think there is the school of thought that says it's too late. I don't think it's too late. I think we can still do a lot to save a lot of countries like the Marshall Islands. So that's my answer. Thank you.